All right, now, everybody. Quiet, listen to me. We're going to start a show. Now, some of you people have been with me before. You know it's going to be a tough grind, but we're going to have a show.
It is the Mark Thompson Show, but there's no Mark Thompson, but that's okay. Who needs him? Tony's here. Hey, Tony.
Hey.
Hi. I'm Kim McAllister filling in for Mark Thompson, and what a show it will be. Of course, it's Tuesday, so right off the bat, you know, it's David Cay Johnston Day here on the Mark Thompson Show. David Cay Johnston, a live interview with him is coming up, but also Mark has left us a couple of interviews behind, and so we'll be talking to a couple different people. Greg Grandin is a Yale University professor, and he wrote a new book called América, América, talking about the ideals that the country not only was founded on, but the principles in which we've acted and kind of have been ingrained in us over the years, and how maybe we're failing that and why. So interesting conversation with Greg Grandin. We'll also talk to Dr. Samantha Sweeney, who's a psychologist. She's got a new book out talking about how to raise kids who are kind, especially in this anti-woke, anti-DEI world, how parents can take it upon themselves and make sure their kids are ready for a world where people are different. So we'll talk about that. And then Jefferson Graham coming in as well. And Jefferson is at the Google conference today, watching to see what happens. He'll come back and report on that to us. He's thinking that, and there are some that he says, there are some that say that Google has nowhere else to go. There's no real room for growth in the company.
Nothing left to buy. You mean?
He's wondering if Google is dead. I don't know. I'm looking at Google owning YouTube, as you mentioned earlier to me, Tony, at Google investing heavily in AI. And it seems to me there's a lot of room for growth. But we'll talk to him about that and what he is seeing at the Google conference today. What's it called? Is it Dream something?
The Google DeepMind?
Is that what the name of the conference is? I don't know.
Oh, no. It's called, give me a second. It's called...
we'll find out.
Cloud, Google I.O.
Oh, Google I.O. Okay, so that's the name of the conference.
Yeah. And
Big
Cloud
news.
Next, I believe, is the other thing they're doing.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so Jefferson Graham will be along toward the end of the show to talk about what is happening at that conference. Meanwhile, big doings on Capitol Hill today, with President Trump going down to the Hill to see if he can roust up support for this big, beautiful bill. It looked like that it was advancing, but now there's some key holdouts, and whatever he said wasn't enough to convince people that he needed to convince to move things forward. So, but he did speak, and apparently, according to many outlets, dropped an F-bomb. We might not hear it here, but here's what he had to say. It looks like this might be after or before he spoke to leaders on Capitol Hill today.
Are Republicans still grandstanding?
Oh, yeah, sure. You have a couple who will grandstand, but I think even the grandstanders should. Look, the alternative is a 68% tax increase. And you can blame the Democrats for that and one or two grandstanders. We only have one or two, but we have tremendous support. But you'll have a 68% tax increase, or you'll get a massive tax decrease. You'll get a tax cut, the likes of which we've never had before. This is bigger than any Ronald Reagan tax cut. It's even bigger than the tax cut that I gave, because as you know, that's being extended and increased. So this is the biggest tax cut in the history of our country. Or
can we pause it, Tony?
68%.
Yeah, the biggest tax cut. What happens when you cut taxes? Well, not enough money coming into the United States, and there's huge concern that there's going to be more debt because of it. So on one hand, there are cuts being made, but on the other, not as much money will come in. So the question, and some conservatives are having a problem with this, is, are we saddling the United States with a bigger so-called debt cloud where they'll have to raise the debt limit ceiling, and it'll be even worse than it has been, something felt for generations to come? Carry on, Tony.
Tax increase. And if that happens, I mean, what Republican could vote for that to happen? Because there wouldn't be a Republican much longer. They would be knocked out so fast. but we're going up to details. This is I'm a cheerleader for this party, and I'm a cheerleader for the country, much more importantly for the country. But I'm a cheerleader for the party, and we're going to go up, and I think we're going to have a very good discussion. There are one or two points that some people feel strongly about, but maybe not so strongly.
On one of those points, do you consider some of the proposals on the table in co-pay provider tax as a benefit cut? How are you viewing those?
Well, we are looking at one thing. We're not doing any cutting of anything meaningful. The only thing we're cutting is waste, fraud, and abuse. With Medicaid, waste, fraud, and abuse. There's tremendous waste, fraud, and abuse. There's incompetent things with it. We have illegal aliens that are multiple killers with multiple murder records getting Medicaid. I don't think anybody minds if we cut that. The Democrats, on the other hand, are going to destroy it because they're going to leave these people on. We're cutting three things: waste, fraud, and abuse. We're not changing Medicaid, and we're not changing Medicare, and we're not changing Social Security. And if I wanted to do those things, I would have done it during my 4 years at Yale.
Yeah. So he says we're not touching Medicaid, yet we know that they've made significant cuts to Medicaid. And some of the conservatives who were holdouts thought the cuts were not deep enough to Medicaid. So this meeting was a 2-hour-long meeting this morning in the Capitol basement. And Trump goes down to the basement and urges Republicans to support his agenda. There's a Memorial Day deadline for passing it. But there are two factions of holdouts: the hardline conservatives who think we're not cutting enough, and then there's moderate blue state Republicans who are really going to feel this and have to answer to their constituents. But he didn't change the minds of either of those factions of people. And Andy Harris, who's a representative Republican from Maryland, says the president, I don't think, convinced enough people that the bill is adequate the way it is, that there are still members of this conservative House Freedom Caucus that are loudly criticizing it and getting in the president's way as far as passing it. He said, I can't support it the way it is right now, that we're still a long ways away. We've another video, and we think this is after the 2-hour discussion. Tony, let's see this video. I don't know if he says much different, but here it is.
That's an interesting statement. I never thought of it that way. But we have this is really just a pep talk. We have a very unified House, and we have a very unified Senate. And Mike is doing a phenomenal job as Speaker. He's going to be there a long time. And we have a man in the Senate. Our leader, Thune, Mr. Thune, is doing a great job. I've gotten to like him a lot, and he's doing a fantastic job. Between the two guys, very different personalities, actually, in certain ways, but they are doing a fantastic job. I don't think the Republican Party has ever been so unified. It's become a much bigger party. You know, we're winning the labor vote. We won the Teamsters. We won votes that look how well we did with the automakers. And by the way, the president of the automakers is now my biggest fan. He said, he did tariffs. You know how many auto plants are being built now in this country because of the tariffs? 3 just announced yesterday that they're building.
We can put a pause on that, Tony. Yeah. Everybody's his biggest fan. The Republican Party is so unified. And then what you get a little later is it's all the Democrats' fault. No listing about why that is, but it's just everything wrong, Democrats' fault. We'll talk more about the big, beautiful bill, America's economy, and what's happening with the markets, what's happening with tariffs, what's happening with our downgrading by Moody's. We'll talk all about that with David Cay Johnston coming up in about less than an hour now. Meanwhile, yesterday, we had America's first flight of immigrants that have self-deported. They were paid each $1,000, put on a plane, and flown home. The Department of Homeland Security had its first charter flight for migrants who agreed to self-deport after they signed up for this program. 64 people did this. 64 citizens of Colombia and Honduras made their way home yesterday. The Department of Homeland Security said this was a voluntary charter flight. It was not an ICE enforcement operation. Often we've seen immigrants that are forced to be deported. They're wearing chains on the plane. This was not that. These people were not chained. They got on the plane willingly, although there was some advice for folks not to do this type of thing, that there's no guarantee that these people, like the Trump administration is saying, will be able to return to America at some point. There's the American Immigration Lawyers Association warning people, don't take this assistance because you might not be able to come back to America in the future. They say this deal that people took is deceptive, and it gives you the impression that there will be no consequences for staying in America without documentation, like being barred from returning in the future. They said no one should accept this without first obtaining good legal advice from an immigration attorney or other qualified representative. They said it's unethical for the government to tell people self-deportation is safe, but then not to go ahead and explain the hardship and the legal risks to them, especially for people that either don't have a lawyer or don't know what their rights are under the law. But 64 people climbed aboard that plane and they went home. And so that's it. The reports are that there were smiles. Everyone got $1,000 check when they landed in their home country. They got a voucher for a free meal or some type of food assistance for the day. And that's it. 64 people are gone from the United States of America. There's another immigration story I wanted to make sure we talk about. And this one involves at least 50 migrants that were sent to this prison in El Salvador. A new report finds out they were legally in America. They had entered our country legally, all on the up and up. At least 50 Venezuelan men that were sent by the Trump administration to this El Salvadorian prison, according to the Cato Institute, which analyzed data for just a portion of these men who were deported, and found that the government is calling them illegal aliens, but 90 of the cases where the method of crossing was known, 50 men report that they came legally to the United States, that they had advanced permission from the American government at an official border crossing point, not like they were trying to sneak in at a non-border crossing. The numbers are called astounding, that dozens of legal immigrants were stripped of their status and imprisoned in El Salvador. The report says 21 men were admitted after presenting themselves at a port of entry, 24 were granted parole, 4 were resettled as refugees, and 1 entered the United States on a tourist visa. Now, does that mean they did nothing wrong? No, doesn't mean that. But it means they were legally here. Now they're not. We'll talk more about that with David Cay Johnston coming up as well. But I do want to get to this interview that Mark kindly left behind. This is Greg Grandin. He's a Yale University professor, and he has a new book called América, América. And I love this conversation because it really gets to the heart of what we're giving up as a country. These ideals, what it means to be an American, what we have stood for so many years, and how we may be letting go of some of those, the things that we hold dear. Let's hear it, Tony.
The Mark Thompson Show.
It was great. I loved it.
How would you handle this? We could try ignoring it, sir.
Morning.
You cannot say you love your country.
Where are my weed smokers at?
Stay at home and get baked.
Right on, everybody, right on. Well, I've got such an exciting guy to introduce you to. He's an honest-to-goodness, brilliant intellectual. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, one of the sharpest analysts of the American empire, foreign policy, the myths that we tell ourselves as a nation. He has several acclaimed books, including The Empire of Necessity, Fordlandia, and The End of the Myth. That won the Pulitzer in 2020. In his book, América, América, he explores how the U.S. has exported its contradictions, its democracy, its violence, beyond just the borders. and how that global projection has shaped who we are at home. He's a former professor of history at NYU, frequent contributor to The Nation, The New York Times, The Intercept. He challenges us to sort of reconsider the narratives that define American identity. So excited to talk to the great Greg Grandin, everyone. Hello, sir.
Hello. It's great to be here.
So excited to talk to you because I feel you've met your moment. I mean, we see sort of the myth of American exceptionalism falling apart in so many different ways, but you detail how we've exported it. I'd love to get into the book specifically, but I'd also like to just have you comment on this moment in history where I feel as though sort of a lot of our preconceptions about the country in which we live may be faltering.
Yeah, and that a lot had to do with my last book, The End of the Myth. We were living through the end of the myth, and the argument of that book was that we were a nation formed in expansion, the idea of limitlessness in all its many varieties, territorial markets, wars, the idea that you can organize domestic politics by constantly promising expansion or promising limitlessness. The idea of the frontier, what was great about the idea of the frontier is that you could project it into infinity. But the fact of the matter is we're living in a world in which that's no longer the case. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no more righteous moral wars to fight. Just look at the way Gaza is sucking everything in. The financial collapse and the restructuring of the U.S. economy, and probably the greatest limit of all is climate change. So the end of having lost the ability to kind of project our power beyond the borders at will, and then to use that projection to organize domestic politics, right?
And
we can no longer outsource our polarization. We can no longer no longer roll over the trauma from the last war into the next war. So it all just kind of flies around the heartland, and that explains the rise of Donald Trump. That's the argument of the end of the myth, right?
Sure. Donald Trump then benefited, and Republicans, by virtue of the fact that they were adjacent to Donald Trump and they have benefited a lot from this period, they benefited from frustration then, from like a lot of what you're talking about, the backlash that was inevitable, given sort of the end of the old way in which we did things in America. So frustration, I guess what I'm getting at, public frustration, public anger, this manifested itself in the rise of this guy.
Yeah, and I think there were real policy decisions made after the Cold War to deregulate, to outsource, to privatize, to impose austerity. I think I think that it created economic globalization, created a dual economy in which 30% do well and we do wonderful and it's great, and and 60% struggle and have they're the people that Bernie Sanders talks about. They're the people that work every day, 2 jobs, and Democratic politics and the party has been blind to that, and it created a vacuum that Donald Trump and the nativists exploited. There's deep roots of that kind of racism and nativism in this country, but it used to be kept on the fringes. As we move forward, you can keep the extremism at the fringes. Now that we can't move, now that there is no promise of a future, right? That extremism comes and it kind of it's self-consuming.
In other words, the promise of the future couldn't be effectively sold anymore. Is that what you mean when you say there's no promise of a future? It becomes obvious to people.
The future anymore, right? I mean, Woodrow Wilson promised a world without war. FDR promised a world without want. Today's politicians promise nothing, and that's the again, not to keep going back. I want to talk about the new book, but to go back to the last book is that the myth of the frontier, the myth of an endless frontier, is substituted by the myth of a border wall, right? The border wall becomes the substitutes for the frontier. And in some ways, even though Donald Trump denies climate change, he's the first climate change politician. He's basically saying, the liberal promise, that all will rise up, all will sit at the table. He's saying it's nonsense, and that resonates with people. So the idea is that we can build a wall and we can continue living the way that we have been living, which of course is another myth. We can't do that either.
But that's interesting because that's exactly where I come down on Trump and those who are really climate crisis denialists. But I mean, Trump is aggressive in his denialism, sort of wanting to get it back to the way it was, everything from coal plants to combustion engines to, I mean, totally ignoring where
the shower heads, the water.
Right. It's like, don't worry, I'm going to take you back to the life you had. Right.
Yeah, and it's another myth. It's and obviously it's the denial is so over the top. It's obviously an acceptance, right? There's obviously an awareness that that the world is brutal and we have to keep the barbarians out, and that's what Trumpism is founded on. Now, in the past, I just do want to say, in the past we hit limits, the Great Depression, and that's nativism, building walls, and racism is not the only response to an acceptance of limits, right? The New Deal was an acceptance of limits, right? A new concept of social citizenship in which we reorganize the economy to benefit people. And so I'm not saying Trump's realism is realistic. It's no more real. You could have a different alternative. And
sure.
Right.
But I'm glad you mentioned this because I'm curious, and you're just the guy to ask because as a historian, you can give me a sense and give all of us a sense of what was happening at the time of the Depression. You had so many disenfranchised Americans, I mean, desperate for anything. It was an inflection moment. It could have gone so many different ways, I guess. I'm asking, really, was the number of those who were so desperately angry and frustrated with the system, or the ways in which that manifested itself, was it so much different then than it is now?
No, I mean, I think it could have gone in either way, and in many countries it did go either way, right? The challenges to liberalism, whether it be from the left or the right, were profound. And in most countries that had a Labor Party or a Social Democratic Party, you were able to save procedural democracy. The United States is unique in that it saved procedural democracy without a Labor Party and without social democracy, largely through the New Deal. And not to make a segue into the new book, but Latin America was absolutely key to saving the New Deal during a very dark moment. But FDR's first term, the Liberty Leagues were on the march. The fascists were on the march. They were extremists on the radio, using the new technology of radio. He had lost his elite support. FDR, a number of corporations backed away from him and were supporting paramilitaries. I mean, U.S. businesses had some of the largest paramilitary organizations in the world, Ford Motor Company and so on, and certainly planters and the like. And so things were dark in the 1930s, as dark as now. But what there was a vision, an alternative vision. I'll say it very simply. You don't beat fascism by calling people fascists. You beat fascism by offering them an alternative. And the Democratic Party, for many reasons that we can't get into in a short show, was primed to offer an alternative. Something approximating social democracy and dignity, and that's what FDR was. And I think that's why he was able to kind of beat back the forces of reaction, because he wasn't just trying to figure out how to appeal to like the suburban voter or whatever these abundance nunigs think that they're doing or whatever. He
you're right.
Spoke in a strong, forceful voice for improving the material conditions of people's lives. And so he welded liberalism, or he renovated liberalism with what we today would call socialism or social democracy. And that's what beat extremism and fascism in the United States.
That's so interesting. And you're right. We've sort of commoditized all of these different voting groups. And so we target them in all of these different ways. And it's easy to lose the plot. Like,
Yeah.
as you say, it's like you can't just call the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, oligarchy, whatever. You need to have a plan that
You need to
appeals
have
to
an
the populace.
alternative. People want an alternative. They want, and they're ready for an alternative. But
And
there's
so
not.
they were ready to embrace a guy who's just blowing sunshine, and they're just hoping that maybe some of that sunshine is for real.
Yeah.
You know. All right, now let me ask you about the book America, America. So again, this is Latin America, which is why it's America and then América.
Yeah, that's why there's America,
right.
America, América. That's why there's an accent on it.
So tell me about Latin America and its importance in all of this.
Yeah.
And its history is fascinating, I think. Yeah.
The book is a 500-year history from the Spanish conquest to the present, and it argues that you can't understand the United States without also understanding Latin America. I talk about it starts with the conquest. It starts with the strong moral reaction, backlash by some Catholics against the violence of the conquest. And that creates the conditions of, in some ways, of political modernism. I don't want to go into all of the details, but this becomes a kind of critique that Latin Americans then apply later to the United States. So there's a back and forth. There's a kind of ideological contest between America and América, between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire, and then later between Latin America and the United States. And the argument is that basically that contest, the big meta argument, creates the conditions for what gets put into place after World War II, the liberal international order. Basically, the Latin America comes into being already a League of Nations, already a United Nations, 7 independent republics that both threatened and legitimated each other. They had to figure out a new way to organize international politics. They couldn't use what the United States was using. The United States renovated the doctrine of conquest. The founding of the United States, the leaders of the United States, and then up through the early 20th century, said that the doctrine of conquest was valid, as a way of taking Mexican land, taking Indian land. That Latin Americans couldn't do that. I mean, otherwise, Argentina might look at the Pacific and say, we want the Pacific, just like the United States has the Pacific.
But when you say they couldn't do it, they couldn't countenance it. That is to say,
they couldn't countenance it, right?
Okay,
They couldn't, because they were independent republics. So there emerges a notion of independent nation states that have to learn how to live with each other. United Nations, a League of Nations, and all of the legal foundation, a rejection of aggressive war, a recognition of national sovereignty, the presumption that the international order should be founded on cooperation, not competition, not inherent competition. All of these ideas that get put into place with the United Nations in 1945 come out of Latin America, and come out of Latin America's long contestation with the United States. And so that's the argument of the book. And then, of course, it runs through the Cold War and the unraveling, and I bring it up to the present, and in some ways Gaza and Trump. But I couldn't just leaving it on the doorstep of Gaza and Trump.
You do talk about in the book moral fatigue, and I'm wondering, you talk about sort of an empire's moral fatigue. And so as you look at the American empire, I'm wondering how you see that moral fatigue, showing up just in the way that we do everything from, civics to media to politics to whatever. Like where is this? First, tell me what moral fatigue of the empire is, and then tell me how it shows up in these places.
Well, I think it harkens back to what we were talking about earlier: a lack of a vision of a future, a kind of inability to come up with an invigorating way of mobilizing people to think of what a positive good would be. Because for so long, the United States' vision of a positive good, to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, was expansion. The welfare of the Commonwealth was dependent on keeping the frontier open, and whether that frontier not be land of the frontier, but in terms of markets, in terms of moralistic wars. Now that that's no longer possible, there's no sense of what a positive vision of the Commonwealth would be. And here's how I put it in the book. if you want to understand the difference between Latin America and the United States, you have to understand the difference between social rights and individual rights. Social rights, every Latin American country has, even conservatives, understand citizenship as comprising a balance of individual rights. The state stays out of your business when it comes to religion and when it comes to speech and assembly and things like that, due process. But they also believe in social rights, that the state actually is active, that it takes a role in taxing surplus wealth and then redistributing it in the form of a social wage, education, healthcare. As Bernie Sanders says, there's no nation in the world, no nation in Latin America, every nation in Latin America has the right to healthcare enshrined in its Social Citizenship. The United States is almost obsessional in holding on to individual rights as the only legitimate rights. And this is one of the things that motivates the intellectual right, I think, is this fear that, and a lot of it has to do with the migration crisis, that migrants are actually bringing different conceptions of citizenship here. There is this obsession with keeping the Constitution pure, original, only, where a virtuous state is only job is to stand down and to protect individual rights. It's not to distribute healthcare or education. All in Latin America, all of those goods, those common goods, are enshrined in their constitutions. And this is one of the things that I think leads to moral fatigue, because it takes a lot to maintain the cult of individual rights.
I see.
You know what I mean? It's exhausting to, and it's punitive. It's odd. Like, it would be nice if we all had healthcare. You didn't have to fill out forms for everything. If
Sure.
you had universal daycare.
I mean, so these two, this large area of Latin America, it encompasses so much of this region, and then our position, which is, keep those, this is our position now, keep those from Latin America from, getting in any further and changing the character of this country. The realities are that life is checkerboarded down there. That is to say, it's really good in some places and really rough in others, and that there is there's a legitimate migration fleeing really awful conditions in some places and going to some places in Latin America that are so good. When help, and I know that's a whole book you've written on it. So, but how did this all happen? How did it evolve to this place where some things are so wondrous in Latin America and some are so corrupt, so destitute, and so filled with violence?
Yeah, when I say every there is this kind of social democratic tradition in Latin America, the reality for many people is misery and this crime and corruption and violence, the spread of the drug economy over the last couple of decades. I think there's different stages. You can go back to independence and the debt that Latin America fell into from Europe. The wars for independence were much longer than the U.S. war for independence, and Latin America was immediately in debt. The United States could use the whole Western continent as collateral to take out more loans, and could use the whole Western, the continental collateral to engage in speculative bubbles that didn't lead to kind of political collapse, but led to growth and expansion. Whereas Latin America didn't have that kind of opportunity. There were no frontiers to speak of in Latin America. But more than that, the Cold War was devastating to Latin America. The violence of the Cold War, the fact that Latin America thought it was going to get a Marshall Plan after World War II because it all lined up behind the United States, and Truman refused to give a Marshall Plan. That basically meant that Latin America had to attract private capital, and the way that you attract private capital is by basically ensuring a pacified labor force. There was no room for a kind of middle way social democratic non-communist left like in Europe or in Japan. And then, of course, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and economic liberalization and neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, was very devastating and created that super class of billionaires, just like, it has here, you know, in
so
many
the
ways.
neoliberalism just
In
expand
many
it's
ways,
like kicked open the markets essentially.
yeah, and in many ways, what the United States imposed on Latin America, it imposed on itself. You know, I mean, Bill Clinton took office in the middle of, at the time, was an unprecedented run of economic expansion. There wasn't an enemy in sight. The Soviet Union was gone, wiped off the face of the earth, and he treated the United States as if it was an occupied country and its citizens belligerents. You know, they did away with welfare. They passed all those, you know, crime bills and terrorist bills and anti-immigration bills, and you know, a lot of it really begins under Clinton to some degree, and I think we're paying the price of that. We're not, you know, instead of taking the opportunity of the triumph of the Cold War to build a social republic that like lifts everybody up, you know, we went whole hog. I mean, every country in the 1970s and 80s and 90s did some kind of economic restructuring because of rising energy prices and whatnot. No other country comparable to the United States in terms of wealth simultaneously assaulted the institutions that could have ameliorated that economic restructions, unions, the welfare state, you know, small farming communities, you know, the assault on all of those institutions that could have helped buffer the restructuring was brutal. And you didn't see that in Germany, and you didn't really see it even in Thatcher's UK. You certainly didn't see it in France, where they were still subsidizing peasants for all I know. But here, you know, the economic restructuring went hand in hand with this intense criminalization and militarization and a very punitive vision of the public order, and that's, I think, what, you know, we're reaping the whirlwind, I think.
And I don't mean to have the recency bias that I think, you know, we all tend to have, but as you look at this broad and detailed historical context, which you talk about in the book, América, and you bring it to today, handicap for me the world of Latin America, and then handicap for me, if you would, the USA and how we fit into it in this contemporary experience.
Handicap in the sense of
what's the future?
What's the future? Yeah. Well, I mean, again, there is no future. It's hard to imagine a future. And I think that's part of the problem. It's easier to imagine as I think Frederick Jameson, a great literary critic, once said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism or something beyond the kind of savage capitalism we live under. You know, Latin America is more social. There's more sociality in Latin America, and you know, which does buffer some of the worst of the violence and worst of the economic commiseration to some degree. But what we're also seeing,
why is that, Greg? Just to follow up on that for a moment, why do we see so much of it there? Yeah.
It comes out, I think, the Catholic tradition, the Spanish Empire was much more integrated. You know, I go into this in detail in the book, how the Spanish Catholicism presumed to be universal, but recognized difference and organized the empire around. So there was no pushing difference to the frontier. There was, you know, Native Americans were central to extracting the wealth out of the New World, but they were also morally central to justifying Spanish dominion. Whereas the British and then the U.S. had, you know, pushed out the Native Americans, right? It was pushing difference out to the frontier. And I think that that created a degree of sociality, the endurance of a kind of agrarian culture, the strength of union movements in Latin America, the strength of social movements. I mean, the landless movement in Brazil is the largest social movement in the world. They've redistributed land, they've seized and confiscated and redistributed land the size of Switzerland. You know, I mean, they keep fighting, you know, more environment. I mean, the paradox is kind of hard to wrap one's mind around. More environmental activists are assassinated in Latin America than any other region every year. And yet environmental activism is strongest in Latin America than anywhere else. Like,
that is wild.
It's like, it's irrepressible, and the commitment. I mean, the drug war in Mexico, but people still fight. They still fight for a decent life, and I think that has a lot going for it. What it doesn't have, one thing, going back to handicap, one thing that's troubling is that the U.S. is exporting a lot of its culture war craziness to Latin America. In the past, the conservatives in Latin America tended to be law and order, anti-communist, Hispanic patricians, that wanted a patriarchy, and now they're running around talking about Judith Butler and groomers and guns and QAnon, and it's all like cryptocurrency,
because they've seen the effectiveness of those arguments in America.
Well, yes, and because they have ties with a lot of the churches and libertarian groups that support it, and different, and there's the Bannon types, they're making ties, and in some places it's effective in El Salvador and Ecuador, not in Mexico. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum has 85%. She's a Jewish daughter of refugees from the Holocaust.
It's a wild story, isn't it? Yeah.
Sitting in the Catholic vice-regal office, what used to be the viceroy's office, the most important position in all of the Americas for the Spanish Empire. And there she is, the granddaughter of Jewish refugee communists, with 85% approval rating, talking about the fourth transformation of Mexico. And by what she means by that is social democracy. She's limited. Mexico has, the Mexican state and military have these, reserves of occult power that, she can't really touch. But she's gradually changing the expectations. So she is a politician.
Right, that's the message that you were talking about at the beginning of our conversation.
He is somebody who actually does have who says, has a social vision that motivates people, and it's there in a country that's poor, that's crime-ridden, that you could see it easily vote for somebody like Bukele from El Salvador. People are tired of violence, but they don't. They vote for her.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It really is fascinating. So. Here's my last question, and then we'll have a link to your book. And I'd love to, you're such a great perspective in such a detailed way on history and on the evolution of various societies and cultures and countries. And I'd love to, visit with you again. But for now, do the cycles that we apply to history, the rise and fall of empires, that's like the new thing everybody's telling me about. Oh yeah, all empires rise and fall and blah blah blah. Everybody's become an armchair historian. Are there really cycles to history? Can you find discernible cycles when you look, and is it something to plan on, or are we imposing sort of a cyclical notion after the fact?
No, I think there certainly are. I think it's true. It's obvious empires rise and fall. It's a question of why. If you people who study economic world systems, people like Giovanni Arrighi, Emmanuel Wallerstein, they understand in terms of the rise of finance capital, and when finance capital comes to dominate, it's kind of the last stage of an empire's power. But I think that's all true. But I think within that, there's still room for maneuver. Look, the British Empire was in decline after World War II, and that's when it passed its National Institute of Health. That's when it adopted national health care, when it was in decline, right? And so how empire, I think empires decline, that or the cycles. I don't know where we are in the long Kandraki cycle of secular cycles of decline, but there's still one could imagine different shapes taking place, and different potentialities. And you see it in people's desire. You see it in those Bernie Sanders rallies. You see it in the protests. You just don't see it in the consultants and the lobbyists and corporations that dominate. You don't see it in Rahm Emanuel. And who's that? O'Carville, Rob. and James Carville and all of these people that have taken that have hijacked the Democratic Party. And
there's not a lot of humble in either one of those guys.
Yeah. I mean, we have to break. I mean, the state and the Democratic Party has become captive to oligarchs and to billionaires. And it just hasn't happened. I mean, it's a result of specific policies.
Sure.
The deregulation of telecommunication in the 1990s under Bill Clinton contributed to political polarization. The deregulation of finance, contributed to the extreme wealth that has concentrated. I mean, they shouldn't be billionaires. They shouldn't be, prospective trillionaires. I mean, these people shouldn't exist. I mean, with all that money comes such immense power, and as you say, power of the political system. I know. I mean,
it's the decision-making process,
and it just turns politics into a clown show. I mean, when you have somebody like Elon Musk and. It's
interesting to hear that clown show on some level, at least aspects of it, has been exported to Latin America, as you say.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everywhere. It's there's still good people trying to do good things.
The book is América, América. Greg Grandin's latest great walk through history, all of his stuff. I'll have links to it underneath this video, and this is the first of many conversations, I hope, Greg. I really enjoyed this, and thank you for being here.
So did I. I hope so, too.
All right, all the best. Greg Grandin, everybody. Love it.
The Mark Thompson Show. The Mark Thompson Show.
This is Mark Thompson.
Hey, which one of you is Mark Thompson?
Love Professor Greg Grandin from Yale University. What a great conversation. So excited to have him. And next, we've got David Cay Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize winning author and investigative journalist, coming on the show. Tony, I was hoping we could get to this video of Pete Hegseth before we get to a little bit of news, and then I expect David Cay Johnston to arrive. But Pete Hegseth was on Fox News, of course, and was asked specifically about what he would tell Americans concerned about the Signal scandal and the safety violations, and whether or not he takes this type of thing seriously. So a little further into the interview, he's asked specifically about that, and here's what he has to say.
Stand. That being said, forget those who are your critics. For any American out there that is concerned over anything that's ever been shared on Signal or any other platform, what would you say to those Americans?
Well, I would point to the success of the Houthi campaign, first of all. But second of all, I wish everybody could see the way we operate at the Pentagon. I wish they could. And I wish those I served with, those I work with every day, could see how seriously we take every aspect of operational security. From the way we communicate, to the way we transmit information, to the orders we give, to the plans we discuss. There's a reason why our nation's most closely held secrets are contained in certain places with only access from certain people. Nobody takes that more seriously than me. If there's one thing I've sort of been offended by, I don't get offended by much. I'm here to do my job for the president, for the country, is this idea that I don't take classification or I don't take clearances seriously. Nobody takes it more seriously than me.
Yeah, he says nobody takes it more seriously than me. Yeah, thanks, Tony. I appreciate it. Do you believe him? Because I don't believe him. He says no one takes security more seriously than me. This is a guy who had a PC installed on his desk in the Pentagon with apps that are not secure on a non-secure line. A guy who's texting war plans, when to bomb, where the bombing's going to happen, on the Signal app, which is not Pentagon approved as being safe and secure. Maybe more safe and secure than the text platforms you and I use every day, but we're not texting our innermost secrets, or if you are, you probably ought not to be. But I'm not somebody who believes Pete Hegseth when he says he's taking all this seriously. I wanted to make sure that we played that. Okay, let's get to news, because there's a lot to talk about, and I have been remiss in not doing news the last yesterday, and I think Friday I missed it as well. There's just been so much, so let's get right to it before David Cay Johnston arrives. This is news on the Mark Thompson Show. On the Mark Thompson Show, I'm Kim McAllister, and this report is sponsored by Coachella Valley Coffee. And if I had the harp, I would play it because the vanilla tea is hitting in the right spot today. Oh, I'll take it. Department of Homeland Security Chief Kristi Noem is now defending the potential suspension of habeas corpus. The Trump administration floating suspending the legal right to due process to help with the crackdown on illegal immigration. In a Senate hearing today, Noem defined the principle as a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from the country, that is a constitutional right. Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire corrected her, to which Noem responded she supports habeas corpus and added she also recognizes the president's right to suspend it. Not all Republicans, as we saw earlier, are on board with President Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill. Fox News reports Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie is a definite no on this. Trump was on Capitol Hill earlier today to try to rally Republicans after the bill cleared the GOP-led Budget Committee in the House on Sunday, but it doesn't look like he did enough convincing because there's still some holdouts here. According to multiple reports, President Trump is expected to announce plans for a $500 billion Golden Dome defense system soon. The Golden Dome is the president's vision for a cutting-edge missile shield that can protect the United States from long-range missile strikes. Trump will be joined by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth for the announcement from the Oval Office. Look at that Golden Dome. $500 billion that'll cost us. The Supreme Court is handing President Trump a victory over the status of some Venezuelan migrants. The High Court lifting a lower court's injunction that blocked the termination of a program protecting the status of those migrants. It allows the Trump administration to now end the temporary protected status program for about 350,000 Venezuelan migrants as legal proceedings continue. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem ending the program for Venezuelan migrants last month, and they have a similar move regarding Haitian migrants set to take effect in August. Can you imagine thinking you're here legally, thinking everything's fine, and all of a sudden, presto changeo, they yank the carpet right out from underneath you? There is a new task force designed to deport illegal immigrant felons being tested in Los Angeles. It's called Operation Guardian Angel, and it's comprised of ICE, ATF, FBI, DEA, and HSI agents. Agents set to comb through jail databases for immigrants who had been deported but then illegally returned to the United States. U.S. Attorney Bill Asalee creating this task force. He says he expects it to arrest or help in the arrest of 40 to 50 immigrants a week from local jails if successful in Los Angeles. He says the task force will be rolled out nationwide. Charles Kushner is joining the Trump administration as the ambassador to France. The Senate backed Kushner, whose son, of course, is married to Trump's daughter Ivanka, in a vote of 51 to 45. Senator Cory Booker was the only Democrat to vote along with Republicans in favor of the nomination, while Senator Lisa Murkowski was the only Republican who opposed it. Kushner is also the recipient of a presidential pardon from Trump after his conviction for witness tampering and for tax evasion. Now he's going to France. State Farm wants to tack on to its already approved rate increase. State Farm set to raise rates by 17% in California next month. The original ask, though, was 30%. The San Francisco Chronicle reporting State Farm wants to get closer to that number by asking for additional 11% increases on homes and even more for condo owners and renters. That hike would likely happen in 2026. Deputy Insurance Commissioner Michael Soller releasing a statement saying if State Farm wants more, then he wants more. He says he wants more data, more transparency, more policyholders served, and more policies written in wildfire-distressed areas. That man who set off a bomb outside of a reproductive center in Palm Springs may have posted videos of explosive tests on the internet. Authorities continue to examine the online footprint of 25-year-old Guy Bartkus, who died in this explosion on Saturday. Investigators say that he'd posted video recordings of tests of various homemade explosive devices to YouTube several months ago. Didn't raise any alarm flags to anybody? One of the videos shows a large explosion in a desert area. Meanwhile, Reddit is banning anti-natalist groups after Saturday's explosion that damaged this reproductive center in the Palm Springs area. The National Transportation Safety Board is continuing its investigation into the deadly crash of a Mexican Navy ship right into the Brooklyn Bridge. NTSB investigators said the ship had left Pier 17 last Saturday and that it had intended to sail down the East River before heading out to sea. The ship had been moving for just about 5 minutes when it collided with the bridge, killing 2 young naval cadets who'd been training on the ship and leaving others injured as well. Investigators say a distress call for help came in just about 45 seconds before that ship hit the bridge. They have yet, though, to figure out exactly where that call came from. Google launching Notebook LM apps for Android and iOS. The AI note-taking and research assistant app had only been available on desktop computers, but now it is available in the form of standalone apps as well. And Waymo has been approved to expand in Silicon Valley. You'd think that where it would have started, but no. The California Public Utilities Commission is approving Waymo's request to add more driverless taxis to the streets of South San Francisco and other areas as well. Waymo's service area now covers 85 square miles in San Francisco and in the Silicon Valley. The company has its eyes set on service at San Francisco International Airport in the future as well. They're currently mapping roadways around SFO. There is a landlord in Los Angeles who will now stop blasting the kids' song Baby Shark in an effort to deter the homeless. A tenant is offering an alternative. Shalom Styles operates the Styles Barber Lounge in the downtown building. He says the landlord was getting complaints, so he stopped playing Baby Shark. He says the LA Mission reached out to him and asked if he'd be willing to give free haircuts to the homeless. He said yes, if they leave the area around his business, he will. He also believes the homeless are posting bad reviews about his business online. And lastly, police in Paris say they've found a bust of the Doors lead singer Jim Morrison that was stolen from his grave nearly 40 years ago. The statue, discovered by chance during a search related to a fraud case, it was originally placed on Morrison's cemetery plot in 1981, which was the 10th anniversary of his death in his Paris apartment. It went missing in 1988. Police say this is a 300-pound statue, and it looks okay. It's got some graffiti on it and a broken nose, but that was already there when it was stolen, so they say it doesn't look any worse for wear. This report is sponsored by CoachellaValleyCoffee.com. It is the most amazing coffee, the most amazing tea, the nicest people involved in this. CoachellaValleyCoffee.com is the website. There are detailed tasting notes, so you know exactly what you're going to order. You can get the roast of coffee that you want. The teas are amazing. I love the vanilla tea, the Moroccan mint. My daughter loves the English breakfast tea they have and the chai tea as well. Check it out, please. CoachellaValleyCoffee.com. And if you do find something that you're interested in, make sure you enter the exclusive Mark Thompson show code. It is Mark T, no spaces, Mark T at checkout, and that'll get you 10% off at CoachellaValleyCoffee.com. The wonderful journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning author,
The Mark Thompson Show.
David Cay Johnston is next. I'm Kim McAllister, and this is The Mark Thompson Show.
The Mark Thompson Show.
All right, we're back, and it is time to introduce David Cay Johnston. He is the founder of DC Report. Of course, he's collected the Pulitzer Prize for his work. He's an investigative journalist. He is an author, a prolific author, and we are fortunate enough to have David Cay Johnston every Tuesday on the Mark Thompson Show. Here he is, David Cay.
Well, glad to be with you. And by the way, Mark sent some Coachella Valley coffee.
Yeah.
We have now switched over to it and have ordered more Coachella Valley coffee. Yeah.
It's like
sort of like, okay, you're going to send me some coffee.
Right.
Terrific. Just terrific.
Once you taste it, you just can't stop. So good. I'm really glad you're enjoying it too. Okay, let's jump into this stuff. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is this big phone call yesterday that Trump had with Vladimir Putin, where he's trying to convince him to enter into some ceasefire agreement, to meet personally with Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine. And it doesn't quite go the way Trump hopes. This is a situation that Trump said he could fix with one phone call. David Cay Johnston, just pick up the phone. The war is over. Putin's doing everything Trump wants. And this is proving to be really problematic. As a matter of fact, we have video. Putin yesterday, after this phone call, says, yeah, we'd like a ceasefire. Maybe we'd like to end the war. But first, we'd really like to know what started the war. Let's take a listen.
The U.S. president expressed his position on the cessation of hostilities, ceasefire. And from my end, I emphasize that Russia also stands for a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. We must simply determine the most effective paths toward peace. The question, of course, is that the Russian and Ukrainian side should show maximum desire for peace and find compromises that would suit all parties. At the same time, I'd like to note that in general, Russia's position is clear. The main thing for us is to eliminate the root causes of this crisis.
What? Thank you. I appreciate that, Tony. Would the root cause of the crisis be you invaded a country that wasn't your own? I don't know.
From Putin's point of view, Putin, first and foremost, wants to put back together what Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Empire. He has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union, of which he was a product, a spy of the old KGB in the Soviet Union, that this was the worst geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Not the Holocaust, not the revolution by Mao with the mass killings in his country, not Stalin's purges and executions, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, which tells you a lot about what he thinks is important in the world. Also, from his point of view, he is concerned about the spread of NATO, even though NATO has never done anything aggressive whatsoever. Putin justifies what he's doing because he sees he's surrounded by what he regards as hostile forces. And of course, then there's this fiction that it's Mother Russia and Ukraine, which the Soviets called the Ukraine, is really a breakaway province, sort of the way the Chinese communists in Beijing see Taiwan. It's a breakaway province. Now, the last part is utter nonsense. 1,000 years ago, Kyiv was a thriving metropolis by the standards of that era, with tens of thousands, or certainly well more than 10,000 people living in it. Whereas Moscow 1,000 years ago was a couple of huts in the forest. And so what Putin is really telling the world is, yeah, I'm ready for peace on my terms, which is we conquer Ukraine, and at a minimum, we get to control what we already took. In 2014, Crimea, where Obama didn't do much, although I think it's very clear the reason he didn't do much is the Republicans in Congress were going to scream bloody murder if he tried to stand up. So Donald Trump has discovered that he is not the Wizard of Oz. Toto has pulled back the curtain here. And remember that Trump at one point said he didn't even need to be back in the White House. All he had to do was win the election and the war would be over. And at what point people who are mild supporters of Trump are going to begin to say, oh my goodness, we got conned, is a very important development in all of this. But what we know is that Donald Trump has 100% absolutely failed. There's no sign he's going to any stronger position. Now, the benefit to this is that Trump being embarrassed by Putin, and Donald is capable of embarrassment in the sense of his self-preservation. I don't mean in the sense of any shame. may step up a little more and continue U.S. support for the Ukrainians. And the biggest thing that the Europeans could do is take the step Finland just took and go much further. Finland took $75 million U.S. value of interest on frozen Russian assets, and they are using them to buy Finnish bullets and other weaponry that they are then giving to the Ukrainians. That's how this works. Republicans and Donald keep implying we're handing money to the Ukrainians. That's not what we're doing. Now, there are at least $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in Europe. And if all the European NATO members would agree, well, we're going to turn the interest over to the Ukrainians the same way the Finns did. We're going to give them weaponry paid for with the Russian interest. That would have a big step. And if Putin still doesn't get the message, they could, of course, say, well, we're going to start handing your money over to Ukraine then as reparations for your conduct. But this is going to go on and on and on unless something changes the ball game, and that's not going to be Donald Trump, who both Zelensky and Putin recognize is a clown who doesn't know anything. He's just a blowhard.
We got a comment that just popped in with a $10 super sticker. Thank you to Tony, who says, David, should we fear Trump has knowledge and or is plotting with Putin to have Zelensky assassinated?
Well, the Russians have been plotting to kill Zelensky all the way along. We shouldn't be surprised if that happens. There's been some recent reporting that I don't trust, but it's out there from Russian-connected sources that there's been discussion among the leadership in the Kremlin of trying somehow to get rid of Putin. I find that hard to believe would actually happen, and the person most likely to be next in line from my reading is perhaps worse than Putin. You know, the old saying, what if we'd killed Hitler? Well, we got Hermann Goering, and he probably would have been worse. So, the real problem here is that each side can keep going, particularly because the Ukrainians have turned out to be brilliant at military strategy and tactics, creating these low-cost drones, repeatedly blowing up aircraft on the ground that the Russians didn't properly secure, munitions dumps, oil and petroleum dumps, which are absolutely vital in a war, to hit the other side's oils and fuel and lubricants. So this can go on for a long time unless there's a game changer. And that's where I think that the European Union and the British, who left the Union, have an obligation to step up. And the way to step up is to say, we're going to pour a lot of additional weaponry into Kyiv to try and get Putin to recognize. And at the same time, tighten the restrictions on Putin. Putin was forced for a long time to sell oil at about 20% below the world price. He was selling oil to India for $48 a barrel when the world price was around 70. And I appear frequently on TV in India, and I kept pointing out that the war in the aggression against Ukraine has turned out to be a subsidy for the development of India, which, 500 years ago was the richest country in the world, had roughly the GDP as a share of world GDP that we do now in America.
Interesting. I also spotted this, and it's two comments now. It makes me think that they don't have a lot of longevity for the dealing with this war and with Putin and with Zelensky, because J.D. Vance said that the United States could walk away from these negotiations if there's no progress. And then Trump said the same thing. He, if no progress is made, they could just decide, we don't have we're not going to deal with this anymore. We're not going to get involved in this anymore. What does that say about America's ability to, I guess you could say with Trump, it's done anyway, our ability to stand up for democracy and to help prop up these, democracies around the world in support of our own ideology?
Well, Donald's problem here is that he has a failure on his hands, and he doesn't know how to deal with it when he's directly exposed with his failures. He's testing something we used to call a trial balloon. An administration through the vice president or some surrogate would put out an idea, and see what the reaction was to it. And that's what J.D. Vance is doing on Trump's behalf. The idea that Donald Trump cares about democracy, it's ridiculous. I mean, he is, as I've said on the show before, effective no later than February 26th, America's dictator. All he's doing now is consolidating his power and trying to vanquish any opposition. You know, his former personal attorney, the frankly not very good lawyer, Albina Habba, if I said that right.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
She is the U.S. attorney designate in New Jersey, and she has just indicted a member of Congress, a sitting member of Congress in New Jersey, who went to one of the ICE detention sites. Now, there is a statute that specifically says members of Congress shall be admitted to any ICE detention site as soon as they show up, and they have an absolute right to be there, as do any staff they designate to be there.
Mm-hmm.
This is an abuse of power without any question. I mean, if you're taking money, like Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey was, and who was prosecuted by the Biden administration, you should be prosecuted. But when you show up to inspect a place and the ICE people thumb their nose at the law and say, we're not going to let you in to look at what's going on, to then provoke an incident so that you can prosecute is ridiculous. And hopefully, if this gets to the stage of a jury, and I would expect not, but if it does, a jury will recognize that this is nonsense. Of course, you could get a judge who will say, I'm not going to allow you to use that statute as defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Representative McIver, who is facing criminal charges now.
And who's a woman in black. Not that would matter to this administration, which is so dedicated to equality and fairness.
Can we talk for a moment about the big, beautiful bill? We saw Trump go down to Capitol Hill trying to convince people to get on board. Apparently, he didn't do quite a good enough job. But there's a worry by some both moderate and very conservative Republicans, hardline Republicans, that the differences in the tax cuts could make the debt America's debt even bigger, could mean that we don't have as much money as we thought we would have, and they have to raise the debt ceiling again and again and again. And I think that maybe even be part of the bill. And this is what is causing some of the holdout.
Well, there's a bunch of things going on with this bill. And I have to tell you that with the exception of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a couple of other big newspapers, the coverage of this bill has been absolutely abominable. I watch every night. I tape the 3 network news shows, and then I selectively go through them on the DVR to watch them. And I'm appalled at the coverage and how bad it is. Superficially, it covers the right points, but it doesn't put things in context. So the Republicans say we have a terrible problem. We have $37 trillion of debt.
Mm-hmm.
So what they want to do is extend tax cuts that go overwhelmingly to the top 10th of 1% by borrowing more money. We're going to borrow money to give money to already super rich people who make $10 million a year and up. And remember, in this country, we have people who have multi-billion-dollar annual incomes. Years ago, I got the IRS, 25 years ago, I think it was, to acknowledge there had been a handful of billion-dollar incomes, and they wouldn't argue with the idea that there might have been a few people who had multi-billion-dollar incomes. At the time, Michael Bloomberg came to mind because I estimated he was making about $3 or $4 billion a year at that point. And now we have billionaires everywhere, and they need tax cuts.
Right.
I mean, this is the very definition of political insanity. But there's a lot worse things in this big, beautiful bill. People under $15,000 effectively face a 73% increase in their burden of supporting the government because of things that are being taken away from them and other changes in the tax code. So we're raising the burden on the poor. $15,000 is less than $300 a week. Next, this bill creates large loopholes. It appears to me, and a couple of tax lawyers from my years of covering taxes have reached out to me, appears to create some large new loopholes in the tax code. We don't definitively know because we don't have the final statutory language, but we'll find that out. Third, they are cutting the very spending that has made us wealthy. And to those of you listening, this is a really important thing to understand and tell other people. There's solid research by a number of people in economics, public finance, and other fields. More than half of the increase in our economy since the end of World War II is due to taxpayer investments in basic science. Companies do lots of research in science, but they do not do basic research. They don't do astrophysics and far out there exotic materials and mathematics. So the GPS on your phone or in your car, for example, your ability to pick up your cell phone and do banking and buy plane tickets and make hotel reservations, all of that grows from taxpayer investments, which corporations then took and put to work, creating tools that are improve the economy's efficiency and promote more commerce. Trump is slashing all of that money. They are stripping NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. People will die as a result of that. People will die. We are behind the Europeans, whose models of hurricanes and other storms are proving more reliable than ours are. They're going after the FAA. And, we've seen some horrible recent accidents in a field that should be absolutely safe. We went 20 years without a commercial plane crash death in this country. Now we've had several incidents and a number of close calls. And this budget is not a big, beautiful budget, even for the billionaires who are supporting Trump. And it's not all billionaires, but there's a class, they seem to be supporting Trump. In the long run, it will be very damaging to them. It will make us all poorer. The cuts to and the policies around infectious diseases.
Yeah.
We can have another pandemic, and we can have one that wipes out half the population. MERS, which luckily was contained when it emerged at the turn of the century, killed every third person we know to be infected. Think about that. Every third person in the Arab world was the dominant intellectual and productive center of the world roughly 1,000 years ago. And in the early part of the second millennium, bubonic plague hit first in the Arab world and then in Europe. It may have killed half the people in that part of the world and had a major role in changing the economics there. We need to recognize that we are all interconnected, like it or not, if by nothing else, our susceptibility to pernicious viruses. So this budget is doing terrible things to our economy and our welfare. It is not a big, beautiful bill. And the only thing standing in the way of it passing are some Republicans whose view is that we haven't cut government enough. They, of course, don't want to cut $1 from the Pentagon. And that we don't have big enough tax cuts for the super rich. And this is so at odds with reality. It's, falls under the definition of you can't make this stuff up. And yet it's treated as the norm. And I'm really disappointed with ABC, CBS, and NBC and how they have been covering this, because you would get the sense that it's just sort of happening. There's no force behind it. Mm-hmm. This is Donald Trump and the coward Republicans who will not stand up to him, even when he's doing things that go against their stated values, with the exception now of a handful of people like Chip Roy from Texas. And what do they want? They want to take more from children, the disabled, the elderly, and the sick, and the veterans, because the rich don't have nearly enough.
They also
and they call themselves Christians while they're doing this.
It's ridiculous. They also seem to want things and to be there are deals being made that Speaker Johnston says, don't worry about it. We don't need to, we don't need to tell you what these deals are, that there are things that they're being promised, and we have no idea. We have no idea what's being promised in cooperation for their votes on these matters.
You just need to go to a quiet room to discuss this. You recall that from one of our earlier elections where Mitt Romney, the Republican standard bearer, said these things should be discussed in quiet rooms, not in public.
Lord.
The whole idea of this radical democracy, when we launched it in the 18th century, was in fact very deeply built on accountability. The Constitution is full of accountability. It's full of measures to make it difficult to change. Trump is just running roughshod over that. He's ignoring the Constitution anywhere it's an impediment to him. By the way, Donald has no idea what's in the Constitution. I mean, he's spoken about the second article and said that I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. Ladies and gentlemen, it's about 450 words long, or maybe that's 450 excluding the presidential oath. It's very short. Go read it. It doesn't say that at all. It basically says you're the errand boy who does what Congress tells you to do, plus you get to be commander-in-chief of the military forces. That's all. That's all. And we need to recognize that while there are three co-equal branches, the legislative branch is first for a reason.
Well, you mentioned the Constitution, so let me bring this up because I started the newscast before you came on with a story about Kristi Noem, who had to appear before a Senate hearing today. And once again, we hear her defend the potential suspension of habeas corpus. She says it's a constitutional right for the president to be able to remove people from this country. What?
No, absolutely not. And it tells you how incredibly ignorant the person some people call Ice Barbie is.
She had to be corrected by a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan, saying, yeah, no, that's not a constitutional right.
Right. Well, first of all, it's a privilege. Let's be very clear. The privilege of habeas corpus, that's the right to be brought before a magistrate, shall not be, except when there's an invasion or an insurrection. Well, we're not in a state of war.
Yeah.
And there's no argument you can make that that's the case. Donald can claim all 350,000 Venezuelans here, we have to get rid of them all because we don't know which ones of them might be gang members, which is totally contrary to the American legal tradition, other than those horrible events like Executive Order, I think it's 1099, under which the Japanese were interned during World War II, and which we subsequently paid some modest reparations for that horrible act. Donald appoints people who have no idea what's in the Constitution, or in the case of Pam Bondi, a lawyer and former Attorney General of Florida, who's now the U.S. Attorney General, don't care. Their loyalty is not to the Constitution, it's to Donald. And only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. Now, the president can take an action, but he would need to get Congress then to approve it. And it's the same story, by the way, on the emoluments clause. The Qataris want to give Donald $400 million airplane, which for national security reasons, if we were going to make that Air Force One, we have to strip right down to being a green plane. That's what they call the plane when it comes out of the factories in Washington State, and rebuild it. And it would take several years. By the way, I don't know if you saw the New York Times, which continues to do incredibly great journalism out there. I mean, really great cutting edge journalism, as do reporters at the Washington Post and the LA Times and Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. Surprisingly, they have not been reined in at the Wall Street Journal. It turns out that no, Qatar didn't say, oh, we would like you to have this airplane. Trump sent Stephen Witkoff, his negotiator on the Ukraine and Gaza situations, and told him to get a list of suitable new jets for Donald. And it was the Americans who proposed this gift.
How
so
embarrassing.
I had previously described on this show that this was, not been charged as such, a de facto bribe. I want to stand corrected. It's de facto extortion.
Yeah, it seems like it. Why are we not hearing more about that? Because
that's where,
I haven't heard that until you told me.
Because here's the problem you face if you're the television networks, where sadly most people get their news, even though most of that news is derived from the heavy lifting by a handful of newspapers, notably the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times. They all are subject to regulation by the FCC.
Right.
They all have locally owned stations called O&O, owned and operated stations, which are subject to regulation by the FCC. And Trump's made it very clear that he will go after their licenses and their source of income. If you're Disney and you own theme parks, a central element in your business, he has ways to go after those. He can go after any other business you have. Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, the owner of the Los Angeles Times, whose latest estimate about him is he's worth more than $10 billion. Wow. He has been magnanimously losing $1 million a week supporting the Los Angeles Times. But he's now started to completely bend to Donald Trump. He actually shook hands with MBS, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, who was behind the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Why would he do that? Well, his fortune doesn't derive from the LA Times. That's a drain on his fortune. His fortune comes from the cancer drugs that, as a brilliant scientist, he has led the development of. And he can't continue to prosper if the FDA starts rejecting everything he proposes. So there's this huge conflict of interest for him. So we're seeing Donald understands how to use the power of the presidency to bring people to heel. And that's what he's doing. He's bringing people to heel. We would be in a much different situation if ABC had not settled in a lawsuit where Donald had no chance of winning and given $16 million to Donald's presidential library and his lawyers. And if Columbia University, when they had $400 million cut off, had stood up instead of bowing down. And by the way, a number of fundraisers, professional fundraising people I've interviewed across the country, all agree that had Columbia said, no, we're not going to submit, we need to raise $400 million, they could have raised that much money in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Because there are people out there who have the money and who know what Donald's doing and would have stepped up, understanding the symbolic nature of this.
My time with you is running short. I just looked at the clock and it's 12:30 already. That's how talking to you makes time fly.
But we got some more time.
I didn't want to leave you without asking you about the economy, because I was reading your article on DC Report called All the Damage Trump's Tariffs Are Doing. And then fast forward to now, where it seems like the markets have evened out. Trump says he's got deals on board with several countries, although I would argue that China is still kind of a giant question mark, and they seem to be on a tour gathering support around the world for trade deals that don't include America. But I saw this debate on CNN over whether the tariffs are good or bad for the American economy. Abby Phillips was saying that Trump's backing down on these tariffs is not leverage. And then, of course, conservative Scott Jennings said getting countries to the table is leverage. And I wanted to ask you what you think about, has Trump backed down, and have the tariffs been as bad for America as you initially thought?
This has been another embarrassing failure for Donald Trump. Donald, even though he has a degree from Penn in economics, he doesn't understand anything about economics. And I recognize that about him. I met him in 88. So by 89, I realized that he was given a degree he did not earn. He just didn't understand the most basic things. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, just came over to meet with Trump, and he made a big, oh, look at this agreement we have. You know, there's nothing in there. Nothing happened of any consequence. He's backed down with China to 30%. Except for relatively small business purchases, which apparently are still at 145%. Although they do things so without announcement, and who knows for sure. But tariffs are not helping us in any manner, way, shape, or form. they're a price increase that's ultimately paid by American consumers. The consumer might be a business at the end of the day. It might be an individual, but the consumers are going to bear it. Trump has posted that Walmart should eat the tariffs. Well, first of all, that's an admission that China doesn't pay the tariffs, as Donald kept saying. And secondly, while Walmart is enormously profitable, especially as a return on its equity, its margin on sales is about 3%. So they can't absorb a 30% tariff on the goods from China. That's just not going to happen. And Donald doesn't understand that we have these very complicated but highly efficient logistics systems for manufacturing between the U.S. and our biggest trading partner, Canada. Remember, he said, "Oh, Canada's not big in trade with us."
Yes,
Tells
they
you
are.
anything about how ignorant he is. There are parts that are manufactured in Michigan, and then they get sent to Ontario, and then they're sent to Pennsylvania, and then they're sent back to Ontario, and then they're sent to New York, where the product is put together and sold. Putting a tariff, first of all, where are you going to apply it? Every time it crosses the border? Are you going to apply it just to the value added by each process? And it may seem nuts. Why would you not all do it all in one place? Well, it depends on where you have the people with the skills, where you have the transportation mechanisms to make it work. Transportation is not that expensive. If you build a TV in Shanghai, it costs less to put it on a ship to Los Angeles than it costs to put it on a train to Chattanooga, than it costs to put it on a truck to take it to the mall. That's how transportation works.
Yeah.
And Donald doesn't understand any of that, nor does he just thinks, oh, there's a trade imbalance. And by the way, we have a positive trade imbalance with the United Kingdom. That's a trade imbalance they're stealing from us. No, we're being more efficient. The people who were hurt absolutely are workers whose jobs were taken away. I've said in an effort at humor in the past that, the most generous people in the history of the world are the unionized factory workers in America who voted in Ronald Reagan to destroy their unions and then went along as their jobs were sent to China so that the rural poor of China could live the middle-class life that they used to enjoy.
Right.
So the tariffs have been bad for us. They're going to be worse. The economy right now appears to be kind of level.
Yeah.
That's just calm before a future storm. The downgrading of U.S. debt by Moody's, you can dismiss on one level as that's nonsense because the U.S. government, like any government with monopoly control of its currency and the ability to borrow in its own currency, can never go broke. Can make us go broke, but the government can't go broke. And if somebody's thinking, oh, I'll get you some Russian rubles. Hey, the Russian government that issued the bonds before this communist revolution in 1914 doesn't exist anymore. As long as the U.S. government exists, it can borrow unlimited amounts of money. It cannot go broke. It can just issue more money to cover its debts. But it will affect the rest of us. And now we're seeing that the 10-year interest rate bond, the interest rate on 10-year bonds, that's a basic measure in the market, is approaching 5%. Donald told us we were going to have interest rates go down. Didn't happen. He told us he'd stop the war in Ukraine and Gaza one day. Hasn't happened, is not going to happen. And his tariffs are costing Americans jobs. We haven't seen the full damage because it takes time for the tariffs and the wholesale firings of federal workers to work through the economy. Every federal worker I know who got a pink slip tells me they're still getting paid because of how the administration is operating this. So, no, this is going to be worse. And I would caution people, if you're an aggressive investor in the stock market, you've been doing pretty well right now. I'm not willing to be aggressive at this moment.
Lastly, on the way out, wondered if you had any comment on the confirmation of Charles Kushner as ambassador to France. I mean, this is a criminal who Trump pardoned, and now we're sending as the ambassador to France.
Yeah, the Trump-Kushner family is the marriage of two white-collar crime families. For those who don't know, Charles Kushner facing criminal case, hired a prostitute to compromise his own brother. He's a tax cheat, and he comes from a family that's just like the Trumps. You know, as long as we get the money and don't get arrested, we're okay. The French will utterly hold this in contempt. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see in the next 10 days what Le Monde and Figaro and the other French news organizations say. I probably will end up on somebody's TV show in France to comment about this. But you know, the French are a very sophisticated people. They're very artistic, and they're very much into enjoying life. You know, you legally can't work more than, I think it's 35 hours a week in France. If you get a second job, you know, you're breaking the law, because they want to have a society where people actually spend time with their spouse and their children and their grandchildren and their friends and their neighbors. They don't just produce for the machine, and they pay a price for it, and they accept that. It doesn't mean there aren't tensions. I don't mean to suggest it's perfect, but the appointment of Charles Kushner is an insult to the American people. And it's indicative of why Donald Trump is utterly unfit to be in the White House. By the way, in line with your raising the question about the French ambassador, there's only one United States president, at least in the last 125 years, who has not had artists and performers to the White House. So Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist, appeared at the White House a number of times at the invitation of various presidents. He's never been invited. Who would Donald Trump invite? Kid Rock and Ted Nugent? I mean, after all, he's declared, because this is a really important issue that the American president needs to be focused on, that the boss is a loser and should go away, and that Taylor Swift isn't hot anymore. I mean, it's good and comforting to know that Donald Trump, as president of the United States, is focused on the really important problems facing this country.
You know, you would think those stories are fluff. You know, that every time I see a story like that, I think, what does he not want us to pay attention to, with you headline grabbing, you know, Bruce Springsteen as it has been, or he's a wrinkled up prune, and Taylor Swift isn't hot after I came out against her. But then he turns around and starts investigations against these celebrities for supporting Kamala Harris, saying that they must have gotten paid illegally for their time. Beyonce included in this as well. And it really then becomes less fluff and more about ways to intimidate people on this grand retribution tour. Because if you can make headlines by saying you're coming out against Bruce Springsteen and Taylor Swift and Beyonce and whomever else, then what does that say for me speaking out against President Trump, or you speaking out against President Trump? And then people get really scared because they see these celebrities being persecuted.
So there are both elements of this are true. Donald knows how to distract, how to use things like this to get people to not notice something else. Okay. And he doesn't need to shave off a lot of news time to get that benefit. But secondly, this is all part of Donald's effort to bring everyone to heel.
Yeah.
And remember, when Donald says, oh, those people must have been paid, he's telling you about himself. When he announced on June 16th of 2015, he was running for president in Manhattan, in Trump Tower, in the middle of liberal America. And every one of his racist comments resulted in applause, big rounds of applause. And I watched that and I said, wait a minute, this is Midtown Manhattan. Did they bust these people in from somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, which James Carville, you know, famously described Pennsylvania as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between. It turned out they were paid actors who got $50 each to applaud on cue. And so Donald is projecting what's going on here. But it's beneath the dignity of the president of the United States to comment about things like this.
Right. Yes.
And this is who we have. I mean, we have an old man who cannot stay focused, There's a video of him I just watched where he goes on for 20 minutes and just completely goes off the question that's there and wanders into all sorts of other territory as he's sitting beside serious people during his Mideast tour.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know anything, so he has to constantly make stuff up to try and get you to think about that stuff. And sadly, tens of millions of Americans, they don't see it, and they don't understand that, well, that Donald has told them, I alone can save you. He is actually their economic and social and in terms of liberty, their enemy.
David Cay Johnston, thank you for being here. You're amazing as always, and thank you for putting everything in perspective for us.
Take care. See you guys next week.
Thank you. Mark will be back next week. David Cay Johnston, everyone. Thank you so much. Always love having him on the show. And now I have to switch over to another interview. I'm really excited because the former tech writer for USA Today, Jefferson Graham, has joined us. He's now the host of Photo Walks TV, and he's been paying attention to a Google conference today. And fresh from the conference to tell us exactly what's going on, it's Jefferson Graham. Hi, Jefferson.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hi.
I would like to tell you that I'm at the conference, but I was watching it online. So
okay.
It's,
at least you're there, though. You look it looks like a tech building in the background.
Looks
so
like a tech building. I'm actually at a friend's house in Long Beach, and we're editing videos together today. Google has been in the news because over the last year and a half, OpenAI and ChatGPT have become incredibly popular. So popular, it grew from 100 million users at the end of 2023 to what's been projected to be 800 million users by June. Mm-hmm. That is a fast jump. I don't think anything has seen anything that fast in quite some time. And the inevitable has started to happen to Google. Apple said a few weeks ago that their search volume on Safari on the iPhone has gone down, and that's Google provides the search for Safari. So Wall Street reacted in a big way. I've read a bunch of analysts saying that they don't see how Google is going to come back from this, that the Google business model of having paid ads along with the search is just going to be going down, down, down instead of up, up, up. And so they had a conference today to convince people that they are as nimble as ever and are doing everything possible to AI Google in every which way. And that's fine, but I don't know about you, Kim, but are you going to Google to use their Gemini, or are you using ChatGPT? I'm using ChatGPT, yeah.
I'm using neither. So, well, I mean, I'm not really much of an AI person, but you could argue that Google, there's a lot of room for growth because they are investing in AI. You know, they own YouTube. The platform is expanding. It seems like it's getting bigger, and Google has a lot of money. So to say that they can't come back from this, I don't know. I'm not sure if I buy it.
Well, it's really funny because you know the way Wall Street works, don't you? It has to go up, up, up every quarter. Mm-hmm. If they can't just stay where they are, which for me, if I had a $5 billion a year business or whatever it is, or a quarter, I'd be happy with that. And I'm sure you would be too. But it just has to grow, grow, grow. Mm-hmm. And I don't see the Google search business growing. It's the search business that makes the money. And even if they do put AI into everything, I'm not sure how they're going to monetize it. Now, I'm not the one who said that Google is over. I use Gmail. I use Google Drive. I use Google Sheets. I use Google Photos. I probably, everything I do online is with Google, except for having an Apple phone. I use Google services. So maybe Google will do it. I've just not been in love with their AI. I don't like the AI on top of, where I used to get search results. Now I'm getting AI results that aren't always accurate. So when you say, oh, I'm not using the search, well, you actually are, because if you're Googling anything, the first thing you see is AI results. So you probably don't even realize it.
It's true. It's funny because my son had to do a report over the weekend. They call it a genius hour, where you pick a topic, you research the topic, and then you present that topic to the class. And I asked him to make sure he did his page about sources where he collected his information. And on his source page, he had AI overview, which is what Google will give you. I'm like, that is not a source. AI overview is not a source. I mean, maybe it's accurate most of the time, but I don't think you can quote it. I thought that was pretty funny.
They did add a new thing called AI mode, which is a new tab on the Google page. And they are citing the sources. Yeah. So they're citing the sources when they give you the information in this AI mode, which ChatGPT does not always do. You have to ask ChatGPT for your sources when they start giving you information. So that's getting better.
Something that Google did announce today is that they're launching this new Notebook LM app for Android and iOS. Used to be available only on your desktop computer, and now they're making it available as a standalone app for any of your devices. And I think this is the thing where if you've taken notes, you feed your notes into this Notebook LM, and it'll spit your notes back out to you as a podcast. So then it can help you study in this regard. It probably does other things too.
Yeah, I played one of their generated podcasts a few weeks ago where they said, "Oh yeah, Mark Thompson, cool guy. Yeah, I know him. He used to be at KGO, right? Yes, he was at KGO, and then he went to YouTube. And he used to be it's these two people talking back and forth, which is kind of fun on the first, second, and third time. I've never used it since.
No, that's it.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if your son would get a kick out of feeding his notes in and hearing his report read back as a podcast. Once, maybe twice. We'll see how far that goes.
I would think as a student, it might be helpful. My daughter has a really challenging honors chemistry class. And so to have those notes maybe given back in a different way would be helpful for her to study. So I think it has some use in some regard, but it's not something I could see myself using.
It would be nice if we could change the voices and change the people that are reading it to us. Like, what if we could have Kim McAllister read that stuff?
What if we have Mark Thompson read it to us? That'd be fantastic.
Yes, that'd be something.
So you just got back from your big grand trip to Route 66, and you had so many stops along the way. Any highlights?
This one question that people say, "Hey, you went there. What was the one greatest place you went to?" And I go, "Oh my God," because I did 2,500 miles. I did 8 states in 3 weeks, and there was so much. There was so much that was great. And for me, the best part was always meeting people, being on the open road. Now, the thing that most people don't realize about Route 66 is it was the first highway. Okay, it was the first major highway, and then Eisenhower decided that he wanted a bigger highway, and he built this highway in the 60s and 70s because it took a while, and they closed down Route 66, and these towns just sort of disappeared, but not totally. And so if you want to go on Route 66 today, you're on 66, then you're not, then you are, then you're not, then you are, then you're not. And it goes in and out. And Arizona and California actually have the most drivable areas of Route 66, the longest run. And so that was fantastic. And then there was a part of Oklahoma that I could ride in as well. And so any of those moments where I got off the highway, I got into the small towns, and it's really easy for me to walk in and say, "Hi, I'm a YouTuber. Can I interview you? Let me put a mic on you." And then we just start talking, and PR people to go through, and you just meet these great people. And so, and they're working really hard, and they're trying to keep the old towns alive and the old spirit alive, and they're having a hard time. And I just gotta be frank. It's hard out there. They are, they are not getting tons of American tourists. They're getting a good run of European and Asian tourists. They're not seeing the Americans. And they've got all their tchotchkes, they've got their hotel rooms. You asked about, I'm rambling, but you asked me about a highlight. Springfield, Missouri.
Oh, really?
We stayed at the Rail Haven Best Western in Springfield, Mo, where Elvis Presley slept here in 1956. And they hand me the key to the room, and I open the door, and I'm in the Elvis suite. I didn't even know it. I'm in the Elvis suite.
Wow.
It was a pink Cadillac. It was a pink Cadillac bed with pictures of the king all over the place and a jacuzzi in the room and a Hershey bar on the bed, by the way.
Wow.
How are you going to top that?
I don't think you can top that. You talked about tourism, though, and it's interesting that there are still a lot of European tourists, because I thought that folks in Europe, and especially folks in Canada, were really cutting back on coming to America, having their vacations in America as part of a political statement against what's happening around the world.
Yeah, but I wasn't in an area that I had thousands of people. I would see tens and 20s.
Right.
And so I was seeing 10s and 20s. Every person I met was from Europe or Asia. And we go to Europe to see the Eiffel Tower and Big Ben and the old castles and the museums. They come here to see the America that they've seen in the movies. They go to see the big wide open spaces. They love it. They love the desert, and they love the old ways. So I saw plenty of them. They're still there. Our first episode premieres on Sunday, just in time for Memorial Day and road trip season, Chicago to St. Louis.
Nice.
And that'll be the first episode. And I'm going to run three in a row. We're going to Chicago to St. Louis to Kansas, and then Oklahoma to Texas. Then I'm going to break and then come back with the other three, which will be New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and then a greatest hits.
Jefferson Graham, it sounds like you're at the airport. That we keep hearing planes overhead.
I'm in Long Beach, California, which is near an airport.
Very busy skies over there today. Thank you for being here, as always. So appreciate you taking the time to swing through.
All righty. See you later.
Bye, Jefferson Graham. All right. I think we've got some, at least one person to thank. This is Chaplain Fred, who's come through with $10. Hi, Kim. It was an awesome historian. That's Yale Professor Greg Grandin he's referencing. And you can, if you missed it, we'll have Tony pull that video. It'll be put out as a separate video, or you can just scroll back to the beginning of this show and you'll find that interview really, really interesting. And thank you for the $10 contribution. Really appreciate that as well, Chaplain Fred. Vilma comes through with $5. The media bends a knee to Trump, she says, as the truth, free speech, and critical thinking die. And sadly, Vilma, I wish that I could disagree with you, but I cannot. And thank you for the $5 contribution to this show. So, so important. This is a crowdfunded show. You'll find us at themarkthompsonshow.com. Again, it is themarkthompsonshow.com. And that's where the Patreon and the PayPal links are. You'll also see that the super chats and super stickers are open. But thank you for all the ways that you support the Mark Thompson Show and that you keep us rolling. Really appreciate that. Tomorrow on the show, we've got a lot going on. Tony, it's a John Rothman day, so we'll have that. Ooh. Also, the professor, I thought it was maybe he's not a professor. His name is Paul Rice, and he is the founder of Fair Trade USA. So Belinda's on vacation, but in order to celebrate It's the Planet Stupid, we'll have Paul Rice on the show, and he'll be talking about fair trade and the ways to protect the environment. So we'll talk to him about that. And that is all tomorrow. Tony, thank you so much for everything today.
Oh yeah, glad I could help. I
Good
just push
pictures.
buttons.
Yeah.
Pictures up.
So good. So awesome. Oh, and another person to thank coming through with Sausalito Steve today with $10. Thanks, Sausalito Steve. Enjoy the sparkles on the bay today. It's going to be a beautiful day in Sausalito. You guys, the After Party Live is next. It is
Links
Travel Tuesday. Links in the chat to the after party, so I'll see you over there. Please join us again tomorrow, 11 a.m. on the Mark Thompson Show. And again, John Rothman will be on the show, and we're going to have a great time once again. Thank you, Tony, for all your help, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. But for now, Shadow Stevens says bye-bye, and so do I.
See you.